Staying supple can be more challenging as we age, so in this video I'm going to explain the different types of stretching techniques so you can pick the right method for you. Hi everyone, and welcome to Exercise for Health. And stretching is a key modality to any health regime as it helps keep the muscles flexible and the joints mobile. Tight or imbalanced muscles can lead to changes in posture or walking gait, which can ultimately affect balance and increase the risk of falls. Some people do a bit of stretching at the end of an exercise activity, and some neglect it altogether, maybe not appreciating its full value. There are also lots of different names given to stretching variations on the internet, which can make the subject very confusing. So I'm going to try and simplify things for you and show you 5 recommended ways to improve your muscle length. But let's start with looking at what stretching is. Stretching is regularly taking a muscle through its full range of movement so the muscle can gradually adapt to that new length. This is similar to adding a load or force to a muscle on a regular basis so that it adapts to being stronger. When you stretch a muscle, you reach a point that triggers what's called the stretch reflex, which simply means the point at which the brain inhibits the muscle to stretch any further. This mild muscle contraction is normally at the point where you feel the stretch. After a short time period, the brain learns that this new length is safe and no injury is likely to occur, and the stretch reflex dissipates so you can move further into the stretch. The stretch reflex is triggered by 2 factors. 1, the speed or rate at which the muscle is being lengthened, which can cause a greater response if the muscle is stretched quickly. And 2, the length at which the muscle is elongated. So as the muscle stretches further, the response is greater and the stretch feels more intense, limiting any further progress. Smaller or less dense muscles won't need as much force to create a stretch, whereas larger, more dense muscles will need more force applied to them to have the same effect. However, everyone responds differently to stretching in the same way that everyone responds differently to cardio exercise or strength training. So finding the right type of stretching for you and your goal will be key. In addition, the sensations felt for a typical stretch can vary from person to person. Some people like the feeling, some don't. Some feel it at a particular point in the muscle, where others will feel it somewhere else in the body entirely. Regardless, any stretch should be performed with correct technique or positioning, with support if needed, and the person should have an understanding of how to modify the technique or position in the right way to enhance the stretch. And this is a skill that takes time to get right. Stretching should also not be painful, uncomfortable with some methods, but it should be tolerable. Most of the literature and research into stretching has been done around athletes and sports people. So to adapt it to my audience that want to improve their health, according to a recent poll, I will simplify the types of stretching into 2 categories. Dynamic stretching, which is stretching with movement, and static stretching, which, as you've probably guessed, is stretching without movement. Let's take dynamic stretching first, which has 2 recommended methods. Active dynamic stretching is the most common form and is best used as part of a warm-up before exercise, recreational or sports activities, because it also increases the heart rate. Essentially, it is activating one muscle or group of muscles to take a joint through its full range of movement to allow stretching of the opposing muscle or group of muscles that act upon that joint for a short period of time, but for a number of repetitions, which is normally between 10 and 20. This form of stretching should start conservatively so that the range can gradually be improved on each movement. In the case of stretching the hamstring muscles on the back of the thighs, leg swings to the front of the body would be a typical dynamic stretch, activating the hip flexor muscles to flex the hip joint, but with an emphasis to stretch the hamstrings by maintaining a steady posture and aiming to keep the leg relatively straight at the knee. I have used some very gentle dynamic stretches in many of my workout videos during the warm-up, as they can be a great way to prepare the muscles for movement, so come highly recommended. They do have a moderate risk for injury though, because you are stretching the muscle with a relatively rapid movement, so they should be done carefully. Another version of dynamic stretching is ballistic stretching. This is taking the muscle to a point where a stretch is engaged and then forcing a further stretch by bouncing beyond that point in an attempt to overcome the stretch reflex like I'm doing here for my hamstring muscles. It is rarely used because the risk for injury outweighs the reward. In fact, there are studies that show that ballistic stretching can have a negative impact on the muscle length, therefore reducing flexibility, as it creates scar tissue in the muscle, which is far less pliable. This aggressive method, however, is still used with very elite athletes and gymnasts under the supervision of a coach. And strangely, I still see some people use this technique as part of their warm-up to a run or other activity. It's worth noting here that making small adjustments to your position during a static stretch or incrementally mobilizing the joint to find particular tight spots is not ballistic stretching, as you're not overstretching the muscle in a linear, forceful way. Ballistic stretching is definitely not recommended by me and in my opinion should be avoided. The second recommended method of dynamic stretching, which isn't really thought of as stretching, is resistance training. If I perform a hip hinge or Romanian deadlift exercise, my hamstring muscles are under load or tension throughout the movement, and if I do it to my full range, I will undoubtedly create a controlled dynamic stretch of the hamstrings. The benefit to this type of training is that I'm actually increasing my strength within my range of movement, which we will come on to in more detail later, but it differs from active dynamic stretching because the muscle being stretched is constantly under tension rather than being in a relaxed state. Essentially, this means you are eccentrically contracting the muscle against resistance until the muscle reaches its full length before shortening the muscle against the resistance back to its normal length. Exercising the muscle against the resistance through its full range of movement has been shown to have many benefits, so although not considered stretching per se, it's good to perform strength exercises to the point where the muscle begins to stretch, providing that the demand on the muscle is not too high. So you need to pick the right load to reduce the injury risk. Right, let's now move on to static stretching, which can be subdivided into two types: passive static stretching and active static stretching. Passive stretching is also known as relaxed stretching and is what most people will think of when you say stretching. It's placing a limb or body part into a position in a relaxed manner in which the muscle or group of muscles are being stretched. This is the method commonly used in many yoga practices where the focus is placed upon breathing and relaxation to allow the muscles to slowly adapt to their new length. Normally, gravity, a partner, a support or stretching aid can be used to help the person hold the position of the stretch, but the emphasis is on maintaining a state of relaxation. Time spent in a stretch of this nature would normally be at least 30 seconds in duration, but the research recommends that older adults over the age of 65 hold the stretch for at least 60 seconds as the adaptations take longer to effect a change. Normally, any method of static stretching wouldn't be recommended before a form of exercise, sport or activity, as it can be detrimental to the muscle's ability to produce force for movement, especially if this is going to be against a resistance, such as strength and conditioning exercises, and it can also cause a reduction in heart rate. However, there are some instances where a short 10 to 20 second static stretch integrated into a gentle cardio-based warm-up prior to a structured exercise program may be beneficial, such as in cardiac or respiratory rehabilitation groups, or for older adults that may find dynamic stretching too challenging. However, static passive stretching is definitely recommended to everyone at the end of a workout or physical activity as part of a cool down, and again, it's a component of many follow-along workouts I have on this channel. This is by far the safest method of stretching and most widely used by active people. However, to make real progress in your flexibility, you do have to set aside a lot of time for it on a daily basis, holding each stretch for even longer periods, in some instances as much as 2 to 5 minutes, and you'll need to persevere because the results are generally slower than other methods. Most people, though, find that it helps them feel better, especially if they're doing it for rehabilitation purposes or to reduce muscle pain, even if it only has temporary analgesic effects. Active static stretching, on the other hand, is definitely the one to opt for if you're trying to make progress with your flexibility or may have hit a wall with passive static stretching. An active static stretch will include an isometric muscle contraction when in a stretched position. I mentioned earlier that strength and flexibility go hand in hand, so any muscle will only be able to adapt to a new length providing it has the strength to do so. A weak muscle is generally a tight one, so actively strengthening the muscle in a stretch position can help with flexibility gains much faster. There are multiple ways of actively stretching a muscle in a static position, but I have simplified this into two main methods. The first is called post-isometric relaxation. This uses a technique called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or PNF, which is a fancy way of saying that you're tricking the stretch reflex response. Although this is an oversimplification, our brain considers our muscles to be in three states: relaxed when it's in its normal length, stretched when it's in its longer length, and contracted when it's in a shorter length. If you stretch a muscle to the point where you trigger the stretch reflex, the brain receives signals that the muscle is at its longer length limit. If you then isometrically contract that stretch muscle, meaning the length of the muscle won't change during the contraction, the brain receives signals to say the muscle is now shortened, desensitizing the stretch reflex. When you then release the isometric contraction, the brain thinks the muscle has now moved from a shortened state to a relaxed normal length one, and suddenly you find the stretch can be increased considerably more. Therefore, in practice, if I wanted to do this type of stretching for my hamstrings, I would need to find something that I can use to stretch the muscle and at the same time apply a force to it for the isometric contraction where it won't move. So I could use the floor as a support, and after adopting a position to get the stretch on my hamstring, I would hold this position for 20 seconds. I would follow this passive hamstring stretch by applying a contraction of the hamstrings by pushing the heel of the foot down into the floor as though I were trying to dig it in and bring it back towards me, and maintain this isometric contraction for 10 seconds, gradually building up the intensity of the contraction in the first 2 to 3 seconds up to about 50 to 60%. After the 10-second isometric contraction, I release and find I can move further into the stretch, holding again for another 20 seconds before starting a second isometric contraction again. This cycle of 10-second isometric contractions and 20-second relaxations can be repeated 2 or 3 times depending on your level of tolerance and conditioning, because this method does have a higher risk of injury. Using this PNF technique has been shown to be the most effective for flexibility because the muscle is getting stronger in its longer length, meaning that the stretch reflex doesn't activate as aggressively when the muscle is stretched into that greater range of movement. Generally, if your passive flexibility is much greater than your active flexibility, then more focus can be placed on improving your strength at that end range of movement. If your passive flexibility and active flexibility are about the same, then more time can be devoted to the relaxed passive stretching to move into a greater stretch. The final method, which is another type of active static stretching, is contract, relax, antagonist contraction. This uses a technique known as reciprocal inhibition to facilitate a greater stretch. This is the body's natural response to a muscle contraction. For example, if I was to bend my elbow, bringing my hand up towards my shoulder by contracting my bicep muscles in my upper arm, reciprocal inhibition would switch off and relax the opposing muscle group, in this case the triceps on the back of the upper arm, to allow for this movement. Therefore, if we go back to stretching my hamstrings again, I can find a position to actively contract my quadriceps muscles in the front of the thigh, which will switch off and relax the hamstring muscles, allowing them to stretch further. These isometric contractions can also be held for 10 seconds before relaxing again for 20 seconds, as with the previous method, and are a much lower risk for injury as you're contracting the opposing muscle being stretched rather than contracting the stretched muscle. This method is also great for building strength in the opposite muscle group, and it can be adapted for any opposing muscle pairs. You just need to get creative on how they can be performed and what position you need to attain. As mentioned earlier, any of the static stretching methods, whether passive or active, should not really be performed before exercise or sport, but are definitely best performed at the end of a workout or physical activity. Energy is still required though for the active methods, and the PNF technique can feel like a workout in itself, so if your workout has you completely exhausted, then it would be prudent to stick with passive relaxed stretching to reduce the risk of injury. One final important note on stretching is for people that have had a stroke, brain injury, or suffer with another neurological condition and have a high level of muscle tone or muscle contracture in one area of the body. The evidence shows that stretching does not have any beneficial effect on pain, mobility, or quality of life in the short term, but the long-term effects beyond 6 months are unknown. In addition, static stretching is not the best form of treatment for muscle strains in the initial recovery period or for delayed onset muscle soreness. However, moving the muscle against a very light resistance would be far more beneficial. To summarise then, I will put up a table on screen now for the 5 different methods of stretching that I recommend and who they are suitable for. If you are someone that really wants to improve their flexibility and reduce that stiffness feeling, then stretching should be done on a daily occurrence as part of your lifestyle, just like brushing your teeth, to get the most benefit. I hope the information in this video will help you with improving your flexibility. If so, please give it a like by clicking the thumbs up button below and consider subscribing if you haven't already. You can also check out the description below for ways that you can help support this channel. But thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay active and keep moving to feel better.
Hey.